My mom's husband, Mike, made me sit in a metal folding chair every night until I finished adult-sized portions that made me vomit because he didn't believe in autism or texture aversions and started charging me money for every uneaten bite until I owed him $852 from my college fund. But then I brought a presentation documenting everything to his company picnic, and his boss's wife read about how he made me eat raw oysters while timing me with a stopwatch. Mike, my mother's husband, had a strict rule about cleaning our plates. He'd serve us these portions adults couldn't finish and stand over us until we finished it. You weren't allowed leave until you finished or vomited. This rule was especially terrible for me. You see, I had autism and a naturally low appetite, meaning a lot of the foods he served just didn't sit with me. But Mike didn't believe in texture aversions. He thought autism was just an excuse parents made up for badly behaved kids. There's no such thing as not liking food, he'd say while dumping another mountain of shepherd's pie onto my plate. There's only ungrateful children who need to learn respect. My mom tried talking to him once. I heard them in their bedroom when I'd vomited after spending 3 hours at the dinner table trying to choke down Brussels sprouts. She suggested maybe giving me smaller portions or letting me skip foods that made me gag. Mike's voice got real quiet and cold. He told her if she undermined his parenting one more time, he'd leave and take his income with him. She never brought it up again. The dinner routine was always the same. Mike would pile food on my plate while giving smaller portions to everyone else. Then he'd sit at the head of the table and watch me specifically. If I paused too long between bites, he'd tap his watch. If I gagged, he'd tell me I was being dramatic. Once I threw up right onto my plate and he made me sit there staring at it for another hour as punishment for the waste. I started getting creative with avoiding dinner. I'd claim I had homework emergencies or suddenly remember school projects. But Mike instituted a new rule that nobody could miss family dinner for any reason. He even changed the time to 5:30 to make sure there were no excuses. The worst part was watching my mom. She'd sit there pushing food around her own plate with this blank look on her face. Sometimes she'd try to slip me smaller portions when Mike went to the kitchen, but he always noticed. He had this way of smiling that wasn't really a smile when he caught her. Things got really bad when I started having panic attacks at school lunch. The cafeteria smell would hit me and I'd just start hyperventilating. The counselor called my mom, but Mike answered and told them I was fine and just needed to stop seeking attention. After that, I started hiding in the bathroom during lunch. Everything came to a head at Mike's company dinner. It was this fancy thing at his boss's house, and Mike spent the whole week telling us how we needed to be perfect. He bought us new clothes and made my mom practice introducing herself. He was up for some big promotion, and this dinner was part of the final evaluation. The boss's wife served lamb with mint sauce and roasted vegetables. The smell alone made my stomach turn. Mike shot me a warning look as she put the plate in front of me. I tried to eat the vegetables first, but they were covered in some kind of herb butter that coated my mouth like film. "You need to try the lamb, sweetie," the boss's wife said, noticing I hadn't touched it. "It's my special recipe." Mike's jaw tightened. "She loves lamb, don't you, princess?" I cut a piece and put it in my mouth. The texture was like chewing on a sponge soaked in perfume. My throat closed up. I grabbed my water, but Mike had taught us only one sip per meal at formal dinners. I forced myself to swallow and immediately knew it was coming back up. "I need to use the restroom," I whispered. "After dinner," Mike said through his teeth. The boss was telling some story about quarterly projections. His wife kept glancing at me. I could feel the lamb trying to reverse course. My hands started shaking. "Please," I mouthed to Mike. He ignored me and laughed at something the boss said. That's when my body decided it was done. I projectile vomited across the white tablecloth, hitting the boss's wife's silk blouse. Then I slumped sideways out of my chair and everything went black. I woke up in the boss's car. My mother held me while Mike drove in complete silence. The leather seats smelled like pine air freshener mixed with vomit. My dress had chunks on it. Mike's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. At home, Mike sent me straight to my room. I heard him downstairs, slamming cabinets and muttering. My mother came up later with a glass of water and crackers. She sat on my bed and smoothed my hair back, but her hands were shaking. The next morning, Mike was already at the kitchen table when I came down. He had a notepad and calculator out. My usual chair had been removed. Only a metal folding chair remained in its place. He pointed to the chair without looking up. I sat down. The metal was cold through my pajamas. Mike slid a piece of paper across the table. It had numbers written in his neat handwriting. At the top, it said, "Damages. Dry cleaning for Mrs. Henderson's blouse, $85. Professional carpet cleaning, $200. Lost promotion opportunity, $15,000 annual salary increase." He tapped the total at the bottom, $15,285. My mother stood by the sink, gripping a dish towel. Mike looked at me for the first time. His eyes were flat and cold. "You're going to pay back every cent, starting with your college fund. She's 12, my mother said quietly. Mike turned his head slowly toward her. She looked down at the towel in her hands. "Then she'll learn the value of money early." He turned back to me. "Your allowance is now zero. Birthday money, Christmas money, any money from relatives goes directly to me. You'll also be doing extra chores to work off this debt." He pulled out another paper. This one had a list of foods with prices next to them. "From now on, you'll eat everything on your plate or pay for the waste. Market price." I stared at the paper. Chicken breast, $3.50. Green beans, $1.25. Mashed potatoes, 75 cents. "Mike, please," my mother started. He stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. My mother flinched. He walked over to her and spoke in that quiet voice that made my stomach hurt. "Would you prefer I leave? Take my income? See how well you manage the mortgage and her special needs on a cashier's salary?" My mother's face went white. She shook her head. Mike returned to the table. "New dinner rules. You sit in that chair, no cushion, no leaving until the plate is clean or you've paid for the waste, no bathroom breaks, no water until you're done." He gathered his papers and left for work. My mother stood at the sink for a long time after his car pulled away. Then she went upstairs and I heard her bedroom door close. At school, I couldn't concentrate. My stomach hurt from hunger, but I was afraid to eat lunch. What if I threw up again? What if it cost more money? I hid in the library during lunch period. Mrs. Chen, the librarian, noticed me there 3 days in a row. "Aren't you hungry?" she asked. I shook my head. She frowned but didn't push it. That night, Mike served me a huge portion of beef stew. The smell of cooked carrots made my throat close. I tried to eat the meat first, but it was tough and stringy. Mike sat across from me with his stopwatch. 5 minutes per item, he announced. Meat, vegetables, potatoes, 15 minutes total, or you pay retail. I managed 3 bites of meat before my jaw hurt from chewing. The carrots were mushy and sweet. I gagged on the first one. Mike wrote something on his notepad. "That's a warning. Next gag is a fine." My mother sat next to him, eating tiny bites of her own food. She wouldn't look at me. I forced down another carrot. My body rebelled. I clamped my hand over my mouth, but it was too late. Vomit leaked through my fingers onto the plate. "That's destruction of property," Mike said calmly. He wrote on his pad, "Full meal cost plus cleanup, $8.50. He pushed a bucket and rags across the table. "Clean it up and sit there until bedtime thinking about your choices." I cleaned the mess while crying. The metal chair hurt my back. My stomach cramped from hunger and nausea. Mike watched TV in the living room. My mother stayed in their bedroom. At 9 p.m., Mike finally let me go to bed. I was so hungry I felt dizzy climbing the stairs. This became our new routine. Every meal was a test. Every bite was monitored. My debt grew daily. $8.50 here, $5.25 there. Mike kept a running tally on the refrigerator. I started feeling weak during PE class. The teacher sent me to the nurse when I nearly fainted during jumping jacks. The nurse called my mother. "She says she's been skipping lunch," the nurse said into the phone. I could hear Mike's voice through the speaker, saying I was being dramatic. The nurse frowned. After she hung up, she gave me crackers from her desk drawer. "Eat these slowly," she said. Her voice was gentle. I found ways to survive. I'd volunteer to help teachers during lunch, so I had an excuse to avoid the cafeteria. I saved the nurse's crackers for the hardest hardest days. I learned which foods at dinner I could tolerate and tried to fill up on those before tackling the harder ones. But Mike noticed. He started serving me only the foods that made me gag. Mushrooms, liver, fish with bones. He'd sit there with his stopwatch and notepad, adding to my debt with every failed meal. My mother grew thinner too. She stopped eating much at dinner, pushing food around her plate. Mike didn't seem to notice or care. He was focused entirely on me. One night he served me oysters. Raw oysters. The smell made me dry heave before I even sat down. That's a pre-meal fine, he said, writing it down. $2 for disrupting dinner preparation. I stared at the gray slimy things on my plate. They looked like slugs and shells. My hands shook as I picked up the tiny fork. No fork, Mike said. Proper oyster eating. Straight from the shell. I picked up a shell. The oyster slid around inside it. I brought it to my lips and my whole body revolted. I dropped the shell and it clattered on the plate. Destruction of property. $12 for a dozen oysters. I can't, I whispered. Then pay for them. I don't have money. Then eat them. We sat there for 3 hours. Mike serving a 12-year-old raw oysters like he's running some twisted fine dining restaurant where the chef has completely lost it. I mean, who looks at a kid and thinks, you know what'll fix everything? Shellfish. I managed to swallow one oyster and immediately threw it back up. Mike added cleanup fees to my debt. By the end of the night, I owed him $47 for that meal alone. My total debt was now over $500. Mike had started talking about selling my belongings to pay it down. My bike, my books, the tablet my grandmother gave me for Christmas. I stopped sleeping well. I'd have dreams about drowning in food, about plates that never emptied, about Mike's stopwatch ticking louder and louder until I woke up gasping. 3 weeks after the boss's dinner, Mike came home with news. He'd been passed over for the promotion. Someone else got it. Someone whose family hadn't ruined the evaluation dinner. He didn't yell. That would have been better. Instead, he got very quiet and very focused. He spent the evening making new lists, new rules, new payment schedules. We'll be implementing breakfast monitoring, he announced. Same rules as dinner. Clean plate or pay retail. Lunch will be packed and inspected upon return. Any uneaten food incurs fees. My mother finally spoke up. Mike, she's losing weight. The school nurse called again. Mike smiled that not smile. Then she should eat her meals. She can't. You know she can't. I know she won't. There's a difference. My mother stood up, her hands shaking. This is abuse. The word hung in the air like a physical thing. Mike's face went very still. Is it? He asked softly. Is feeding a child abuse? Is teaching responsibility abuse? Is expecting basic manners at a business dinner abuse? He stood up slowly. My mother took a step back. You know what's abuse? He continued in that terrible quiet voice. A mother who enables her child's manipulation. A mother who'd rather see her daughter grow up thinking the world will cater to her every whim. He moved closer to my mother. She pressed against the counter. But if you think I'm abusive, there's the door. Take your daughter and go. See how far you get without my income. See which apartment you can afford. See which special schools you can pay for. My mother's face crumpled. She shook her head, tears running down her cheeks. That's what I thought, Mike said. He turned to me. Breakfast starts tomorrow, 6 a.m. sharp. Full meal, clean plate, or pay retail. He left the room. My mother slid down the cabinet and sat on the floor, crying quietly. I wanted to comfort her, but I didn't know how. We were both trapped. That night, I lay in bed making plans. I had to find a way to fight back. But I was 12, autistic, and already exhausted from just trying to survive each meal. I thought about the boss's dinner, how Mike's face had changed when I threw up on Mrs. Henderson, how his careful control had cracked for just a moment. Mike cared about appearances, about his reputation, about being seen as successful and in control. Maybe that was something I could use. But first, I had to survive breakfast. The alarm went off at 5:45 a.m. I'd barely slept, my stomach churning with dread about what Mike had planned for breakfast. I pulled on my school clothes and went downstairs. Mike was already in the kitchen, arranging plates. The metal folding chair waited for me at the table. On the counter sat a pan of scrambled eggs, bacon, and what looked like a full loaf's worth of toast. He turned when I entered, holding a plate piled high with food. The eggs alone would have fed 3 people. He set it in front of my chair with a heavy thunk. I sat down. The metal was even colder in the morning. Mike placed his stopwatch and notepad on the table. My mother came in wearing her work uniform, moving quietly to pour coffee. Mike checked his watch. 6 a.m. exactly. He clicked the stopwatch. I picked up my fork and started with the eggs. They were dry and rubbery, cooked until they squeaked against my teeth. I managed 5 bites before my jaw started aching. The bacon was burnt, each piece requiring extensive chewing. My throat felt like sandpaper. 20 minutes in, I'd eaten maybe a quarter of the plate. Mike made notes on his pad. My mother stood at the counter, gripping her coffee mug. At 6:30, Mike stood up. He scraped the remaining food into a container and weighed it on the kitchen scale. More calculations on his notepad. He showed me the total. $7.25 for wasted breakfast. My debt was now $542.75. I grabbed my backpack and headed for the door, but Mike blocked my path. He handed me a brown paper bag. Inside were 2 peanut butter sandwiches, an apple, carrot sticks, and a note. The note listed each item's price and instructions to return any uneaten food for inspection. At school, I went straight to the library. Mrs. Chen was shelving books. She noticed the dark circles under my eyes but didn't comment. I tucked the lunch bag into my backpack, planning to deal with it later. During first period, my stomach growled so loudly that kids turned to stare. By third period, I felt lightheaded. The room spun when I stood up to turn in my assignment. At lunch, I hid in the bathroom stall and forced myself to eat 1 sandwich. The peanut butter stuck to the roof of my mouth. I managed half the apple before my stomach cramped. The rest went back in the bag. After school, I walked home slowly, dreading what would come next. Mike's car was already in the driveway. He must have left work early. He met me at the door and held out his hand for the lunch bag. I gave it to him. He examined each item, weighing the half-eaten apple and untouched sandwich on his kitchen scale. $3.50 added to my debt. We were now at $546.25. Dinner that night was liver and onions. The smell filled the kitchen like rotting metal. Mike served me an adult-sized portion, the liver gray and bleeding juice across the plate. I cut the smallest possible piece and put it in my mouth. The texture was grainy, metallic. My throat closed instantly. I grabbed my empty water glass out of habit. Mike shook his head and tapped his stopwatch. No water until the plate was clean. I chewed and chewed, but the liver wouldn't break down. It sat in my mouth like wet sand. Finally, I forced myself to swallow. My body immediately rejected it. I lurched forward, vomit splattering across the table. Mike calmly added numbers to his notepad. Meal cost, cleanup supplies, his time supervising, $18.75. As I cleaned up the mess, he announced new rules. Since I couldn't handle regular portions, he would now serve me double. I needed to learn that food was not optional. My mother dropped her fork. It clattered on her plate. Mike turned to look at her, his expression flat. She picked up the fork and continued eating in silence. Over the next week, Mike's campaign intensified. Double portions at every meal. Breakfast inspection at 6 a.m. sharp. Lunch bag checks after school. The metal chair at dinner. No cushion. No bathroom breaks. My debt climbed rapidly. $565, $592, $634. Mike updated the total on the refrigerator each night with a black marker. I grew weaker. Standing up too fast made me dizzy. My clothes hung loose. Teachers started noticing. Ms. Rodriguez pulled me aside after English class to ask if everything was okay at home. I nodded and mumbled something about a growth spurt. Mike added new foods to his arsenal. Sardines, blue cheese, pickled herring. Each night brought fresh horrors, served in massive quantities. He timed every bite, documented every gag, charged for every failure. One evening, he served me a mixing bowl full of coleslaw. The mayonnaise smell made my eyes water. I managed 3 bites before running to the sink. Mike added $22 to my debt for food waste and disrupting family dinner. My mother had had stopped eating almost entirely. She'd push food around her plate, taking tiny bites when Mike watched her. Dark circles appeared under her eyes. Her uniform hung loose on her frame. I started keeping a notebook hidden under my mattress. I wrote down everything: the foods, the times, the amounts Mike charged, my growing debt, how many times I threw up, how many hours I spent in the metal chair. At school, I researched autism and eating disorders in the library. I printed articles about texture sensitivity and sensory processing issues. I wasn't being dramatic or ungrateful. My brain was literally wired differently. But I knew Mike wouldn't care about articles. He cared about control, about winning, about being right. 2 weeks into the new routine, something shifted. Mike came home from work in a terrible mood. His boss had given the promotion project to someone else entirely, someone who hadn't embarrassed the company at a dinner party. That night, he served me raw fish. Sashimi, he called it. Thick slabs of raw tuna that smelled like the ocean. My plate held enough for 4 people. I stared at the glistening pink flesh. My hands shook as I picked up the chopsticks he'd provided. The first piece felt like cold rubber in my mouth. I gagged immediately. Mike made a note. $45 for premium sashimi grade tuna. I tried again. This time I held my breath, trying to swallow without tasting, but my throat refused. The fish came back up, along with bile. Mike's pen scratched across paper. Cleanup fee. Wasted food. Disrespect for Japanese cuisine. My debt jumped to $712. My mother suddenly stood up. Her chair scraped against the floor. Mike looked at her, eyebrows raised. She walked to the bathroom without a word. We heard the lock click. Mike's jaw tightened. He turned back to me, his eyes cold. I would sit there until the plate was clean or I'd paid for every piece. 3 hours later, I'd managed 2 pieces of fish and vomited 4 times. My debt reached $780. Mike finally released me to bed, but not before announcing that tomorrow's breakfast would be doubled again. I lay in bed that night, hungry and nauseous, planning. Mike had shown me his weakness at the boss's dinner. He cared desperately about appearances, about being seen as successful, in control, the perfect family man. Maybe I couldn't win at his food game, but perhaps I could play a different game entirely. Mike's tracking food debt like he's running a hedge fund for hatred. Those spreadsheet skills could have gotten him promoted if he'd focused on actual work instead of torturing children. The next morning, I forced down what I could at breakfast, adding only $12 to my debt. At school, instead of hiding in the library, I went to see Mrs. Chen during lunch. I told her I was working on a project about family dynamics and nutrition. Could she help me find some books? She pulled several from the shelves, including one about emotional abuse disguised as parenting. I also visited the computer lab. I created a new email account and started researching. Not legal things, Mike would expect that. Instead, I looked up his company, his boss, his coworkers, the promotion he'd lost. His company had a family picnic coming up in 2 weeks. All employees and their families were invited. It was a big deal, according to the company newsletter. Team building, community, family values. That night at dinner, Mike served me Brussels sprouts swimming in butter. The smell alone triggered my gag reflex. But I had something else on my mind now. As I struggled with the first bite, I casually mentioned the school was having a nutrition awareness week. We were supposed to track everything we ate and report on family meal habits. Mike's hand paused over his notepad. He asked what kind of report. I explained it was about portion sizes, meal timing, family dinner dynamics. The teacher wanted photos of our plates, records of what we ate. His eyes narrowed. He said I wasn't participating in that project. I nodded obediently and went back to choking down Brussels sprouts, but the seed was planted. Mike was careful now, watching me for signs of documentation. He started checking my backpack, my room, my school folders. He found nothing because I kept my real notes in my locker. A week before the company picnic, Mike's paranoia had grown. He'd reduced portions slightly, though still far more than I could handle. He'd stopped the breakfast monitoring, claiming he needed to get to work early for a new project. My debt had stabilized at $847, though he still updated it nightly on the refrigerator. My mother had found her voice in small ways. She'd started making comments about the grocery bill, mentioning how much food was being wasted, wondering aloud if there were more efficient ways to teach responsibility. Mike would silence her with a look, but I could see something shifting in her eyes. The fear was still there, but underneath it, something else was growing. 3 days before the company picnic, I made my move. During library time, I asked Mrs. Chen if I could use the computer to type up my family nutrition project. She agreed, happy to see me taking an interest in schoolwork again. I created a presentation, not about legal definitions of abuse or custody laws. Instead, I made a simple slideshow about my family's dinner routine, photos I'd secretly taken of my plates, the list of foods and prices Mike had left on the counter, a chart showing my weight loss over the past month. I titled it, My Family's Approach to Nutrition Education. I printed copies and tucked them into my backpack, hidden inside my math textbook. Mike still checked my bag nightly, but he never opened the textbooks. The night before the company picnic, Mike was in high spirits. This was his chance to show his boss that his family was perfect, despite the dinner party incident. He laid out our clothes, instructed us on conversation topics, reminded us about table manners. At dinner, he served a normal-sized portion of spaghetti. I ate what I could, grateful for the reprieve. He only added $5 to my debt for the remainder. As we cleared the table, I mentioned how excited I was for the picnic, how I couldn't wait to meet his coworkers and boss again, to show them how much I'd learned about food appreciation since their dinner party. Mike's smile faltered for just a moment, then he recovered, reminding me that I would eat everything on my plate at the picnic. No exceptions, no embarrassments. I nodded eagerly. Of course, I'd learned so much from his teaching methods. I couldn't wait to share what I'd learned. That night, I heard my parents arguing in hushed voices. My mother was saying something about appearances. Mike's voice was sharp, controlled, then silence. The morning of the picnic dawned bright and clear. Mike dressed us like dolls, checking every detail. My mother wore a sundress that hung loose on her thin frame. I wore a dress that had fit perfectly 2 months ago, but now needed a belt. In the car, Mike reviewed the rules. We would be a perfect family. We would eat everything served. We would smile and be polite and show everyone that the dinner party was a fluke. The company picnic was held at a large park with pavilions and play areas. Families milled around, kids running between tables laden with food. I spotted Mike's boss near the grills, his wife beside him in casual clothes. Mike steered us toward them, his hand firm on my shoulder. Time to show them what a perfect family we were. But I had my own plans. In my small purse, folded carefully, were 3 copies of my presentation. One for Mike's boss, one for his wife, one for whoever else might be interested in our family's approach to nutrition education. The game was about to change. Mike guided us through the crowd, his grip on my shoulder tightening as we approached his boss. Mr. Henderson stood by the grills, flipping burgers and chatting with other employees. His wife noticed us first, her expression carefully neutral as we approached. Mike pushed me slightly forward, his voice taking on that fake cheerful tone he used for work people. He greeted the Hendersons warmly, as if the dinner party disaster had never happened. Mrs. Henderson's eyes lingered on me, taking in my loose dress and hollow cheeks. She offered a gentle smile and asked how I was feeling. Mike answered for me, explaining that I'd been under the weather but was much better now. The conversation turned to work matters. Mike positioned himself to block me from the Hendersons' direct view while he discussed the new project he'd been assigned. I stood quietly, feeling the folded papers in my purse. Other families arrived at our cluster. Mike introduced us to his coworkers with practiced ease. Everyone was polite, but I caught the quick glances, the way conversations stuttered when they looked at my mother's thin frame and my obvious weight loss. When they called everyone to line up for food, Mike steered me firmly to the buffet line. He stood close behind me as I moved along the tables. Potato salad, coleslaw, baked beans, hamburgers, hot dogs, chips, cookies. Mike murmured instructions in my ear about taking reasonable portions, about being grateful for the company's generosity. His hand hovered near my plate, ready to add more if my portions looked looked too small. I took modest amounts of everything, my stomach already churning at the mixture of smells. We found seats at a picnic table with 2 other families from Mike's apartment. He positioned me where he could watch every bite. The other families chatted about summer plans and kids' activities. Mike contributed appropriate comments while monitoring my plate. I forced down small bites, spacing them out to look like normal eating. A little girl across from me wrinkled her nose at her potato salad and pushed it aside. Her mother didn't comment, just offered her some fruit instead. Mike's jaw tightened as he watched this casual acceptance of food preferences. Halfway through the meal, I felt the familiar sensation of my throat closing. The combination of mayonnaise-heavy salads and anxiety was overwhelming. I pressed my napkin to my lips, fighting the urge to gag. Mike's hand landed on my back. To others, it probably looked supportive, but his fingers pressed hard into my spine, a silent warning. I forced myself to swallow, tears pricking my eyes. Mrs. Henderson appeared at our table, asking if anyone needed anything. Her gaze lingered on my barely touched plate and tear-bright eyes. Mike assured her everything was wonderful, complimenting the food selection. She mentioned there were activities for kids by the playground, face painting, sack races, water balloons. Perhaps I'd like to take a break and join the fun. Mike started to decline for me, but Mr. Henderson called him over to meet someone from corporate. Mike hesitated, torn between the networking opportunity and maintaining control over me. The corporate contact was already walking over. He had no choice but to go, shooting me a warning look as he left. Mrs. Henderson sat down in his vacant spot. She didn't say anything at first, just watched the other families enjoying their meals. Then she mentioned quietly that she'd noticed I seemed to struggle with certain textures at their dinner party. My mother shifted uncomfortably beside me. Mrs. Henderson continued, saying her nephew had similar challenges. He was autistic and had severe food aversions. It had taken years to find strategies that worked for him. She asked if I'd been evaluated for sensory processing differences. Before my mother could deflect, I found myself nodding. The words tumbled out, explaining my autism diagnosis, my texture issues, how certain foods made me physically ill. Mrs. Henderson listened without judgment. She asked gentle questions about what foods I could tolerate, what textures were hardest. My mother remained silent, but I could feel her tension. When Mrs. Henderson asked about meal times at home, I saw my opportunity. I reached into my purse and pulled out one of my folded presentations. My hands shook as I smoothed it out on the picnic table. I explained it was a project I'd done for school about family nutrition. Would she like to see it? She looked curious and agreed. My mother made a small sound of protest, but Mrs. Henderson was already reading. The presentation was simple. Photos of the massive portions on my plate, the price list Mike had created, a graph showing my weight loss, notes about hours spent at the dinner table, the metal chair, the vomiting. Oh, Mrs. Henderson showing up with perfect timing while Mike's busy networking is like watching someone finally draw the right card in poker. Suddenly the whole table shifts and our girls holding aces with that presentation ready to go. Mrs. Henderson's expression changed as she read. Her eyes flicked to my mother, who had gone very pale. She studied the photos of plates piled high with foods that would challenge any child, let alone one with sensory issues. She reached the page documenting my debt, $852 now, accumulated from uneaten food and cleanup fees. The itemized list showed charges for gagging, for needing water, for taking too long to chew. Mike returned just as she turned to the last page. He saw the papers spread on the table and his face went white, then red. He reached for them, but Mrs. Henderson pulled them closer, still reading. The last page showed a photo I'd taken in the mirror that morning. My dress hanging loose, my collarbones sharp under thin skin. Next to it, a school photo from 3 months ago showing a healthy, normal weight child. Mike's voice was strained as he suggested we should let Mrs. Henderson enjoy the picnic. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. She asked if this was accurate, if he really charged me money for not finishing adult-sized portions. He laughed, the sound forced and hollow. He explained it was a teaching tool about responsibility and not wasting food. Children needed to learn the value of money and respect for resources. Mrs. Henderson asked how a 12-year-old was supposed to pay an $852 debt. Mike explained about the college fund, birthday money, extra chores, all perfectly reasonable consequences for wasteful behavior. Other people had started noticing the tension at our table. Mike's coworkers glanced over, curious about the papers Mrs. Henderson held. Mr. Henderson approached, asking if everything was all right. His wife handed him my presentation without a word. As he read, Mike launched into explanations about discipline and structure, how children today were coddled, allowed to be picky eaters, how he was teaching valuable life lessons. Mr. Henderson studied the photos of my plates. He asked Mike if he really served a child with autism double portions as punishment, if he really made me sit in a metal chair for hours until I vomited or paid for the food. Mike's explanations became more frantic. He talked about ungrateful children, about enabling bad behavior, about the importance of rules. Several of his coworkers had drifted closer, drawn by his raised voice. I pulled out the other copies of my presentation. I handed one to a woman from Mike's department who'd been kind to me earlier, another to a man who'd asked about my school. They read in silence while Mike sputtered about privacy and family business. My mother finally spoke. Her voice was quiet but clear. She confirmed that everything in my presentation was true, that Mike had instituted these rules after I'd gotten sick at their dinner party, that my debt was real, the punishments accurate. Mike turned on her, his face twisted with rage. He reminded her about their agreement, about financial realities. She met his gaze steadily and said some things were more important than money. The picnic had gone quiet around us. Families at nearby tables watched the scene unfold. Mike seemed to realize how many people were staring. His careful control cracked as he demanded we leave immediately. Mr. Henderson stepped between Mike and our table. He suggested Mike take a walk to cool down. They could discuss this privately, away from the families. Mike hesitated, caught between his fury and his desperate need to salvage his professional reputation. Mrs. Henderson put her arm around my shoulders. She suggested my mother and I go enjoy the activities while the men talked. Her tone was gentle but firm. My mother nodded, gathering our things with shaking hands. As we walked away, I heard Mr. Henderson asking Mike to explain his teaching methods in more detail. Other employees had gathered, my presentation passing between them. Mike's voice grew defensive, then pleading. Mrs. Henderson guided us to a quiet spot under a tree. She asked if we had somewhere safe to go. Family, friends, anyone who could help. My mother mentioned her sister lived 2 hours away, but she hadn't spoken to her in years because Mike didn't approve. Mrs. Henderson pulled out her phone and handed it to my mother. She said to call whoever she needed to call, that they would handle Mike, that we didn't have to go home with him. My mother's hands shook as she dialed her sister's number. I could hear my aunt's voice through the phone, surprised, then concerned, then furious, as my mother explained our situation in halting words. While my mother talked, Mrs. Henderson asked if I had any belongings I couldn't bear to leave behind. I thought of my hidden notebook, my small collection of library books, the stuffed elephant my grandmother had given me before she died. She made another call. Within minutes, a woman from Human Resources appeared. She listened as Mrs. Henderson explained the situation, her expression growing grimmer with each detail. She asked to see my presentation. I watched Mike across the park. He stood surrounded by his coworkers and superiors, his gestures becoming wilder as he tried to explain away what they'd read. Mr. Henderson's expression was stone-cold professional. My aunt arrived faster than seemed possible. She burst out of her car and ran to my mother, wrapping her in a fierce hug. She cupped my face in her hands, apologizing for not knowing, for not checking in, for letting Mike isolate us. The HR woman returned with papers. She explained that the company had a zero-tolerance policy for employees who brought the company into disrepute. Mike's behavior, especially after the dinner party incident, reflected poorly on their values. She said security would escort Mike from the premises once Mr. Henderson finished speaking with him. His personal items from his office would be mailed to him. He was not to contact anyone from the company or their families. My mother asked about his final paycheck, the insurance, all the financial threats he'd held over our heads. The HR woman assured her they would handle the transition properly. There were resources available, procedures for situations like this. My aunt interrupted to say none of that mattered. We were coming home with her immediately. She had room. Her husband was already preparing the guest rooms. We would figure out the rest later. I watched Mike's world crumble from across the park. His boss walked away, dismissing him with a final handshake. His coworkers dispersed, avoiding eye contact. Security appeared, discreet but firm. Mike's eyes found us across the distance. The rage there made my stomach clench. But then my aunt stepped in front of me, blocking his view. My mother's hand found mine. Mrs. Henderson stood with us, a protective wall of women. We left before Mike did. My aunt drove while my mother sat in the passenger seat, crying silent tears of relief. I sat in the back, my presentation clutched in my hands, watching the familiar streets disappear. My aunt's house smelled like cinnamon and coffee. She showed us to our rooms, both decorated in soft colors with thick quilts on the beds. She said we could stay as long as we needed, forever, if we wanted. That night, for the first time in months, I ate dinner without fear. My aunt made simple foods, offering choices, accepting when I said I was full. No scales, no timers, no metal chairs, no debt. My mother called a lawyer the next morning. My aunt had contacted one who specialized in family law. They discussed divorce proceedings, custody arrangements, restraining orders, all the legal protections we'd need. Mike tried to contact us repeatedly. Phone calls, emails, messages through mutual acquaintances. He cycled between rage and pleading, threats and apologies. We documented everything but didn't respond. 2 weeks later, we returned to the house with a police escort to gather our belongings. Mike wasn't there, forced to stay away by a temporary restraining order. The debt tally still hung on the refrigerator, $852 in black marker. I took it down and folded it carefully. Evidence, the lawyer said. Documentation of financial abuse to go along with everything else. I packed my hidden notebook, my library books, my grandmother's elephant. My mother packed photo albums Mike had threatened to throw away, jewelry he'd said she didn't deserve, clothes that finally fit her again as she slowly regained weight. We took what mattered and left the rest. The divorce proceedings moved forward. Mike fought every step, but my presentation had been shared with the court. Multiple witnesses from the company picnic provided statements. Mrs. Henderson testified about the dinner party and what she'd observed. The judge ordered Mike to pay child support and alimony. He was granted supervised visitation, which I declined to participate in. The autism diagnosis he denied became part of the official record, along with documentation of the trauma his teaching methods had caused. Months passed. My mother found a job at a local bakery, her face lighting up when she talked about decorating cakes. I started therapy with someone who understood autism and food trauma. Slowly, mealtimes became less frightening. My aunt never pressured us to leave. She converted her home office into a permanent bedroom for me, painting it my favorite shade of blue. She learned about autism, reading every book and article she could find. She celebrated my small victories, like trying a new food or finishing a meal without anxiety. A year later, we heard Mike had moved to another state. He'd found work at a smaller company, though nothing like his previous position. The last anyone heard, he was living alone in a studio apartment, still bitter about losing everything. But we had found something better. A home where food was nourishment, not punishment. Where my autism was understood, not denied. Where love didn't come with price tags and threats. I kept my presentation, tucked away in a memory box. Mike's career just became as empty as those plates he forced her to clean. Watching him explain teaching methods to his boss is like watching someone try to sell ice to penguins. A reminder of the day I learned that sometimes the best way to fight a bully isn't with their weapons, but with the simple truth of their actions brought into the light. The metal folding chair went to the garage sale, along with Mike's stopwatch and the kitchen scale. We donated the money to a local autism support group. It felt like the right kind of justice, turning his tools of control into resources for understanding. The next few months brought challenges I hadn't anticipated. Living with my aunt meant adjusting to a completely different routine. She worked from home as a graphic designer, which meant she was always around. At first, this felt suffocating after years of hiding my struggles, but she gave me space, never pushing, just being available. My mother threw herself into job hunting with desperate energy. She'd wake up at dawn to update her resume, practice interview questions, apply for anything that might pay enough to contribute. The guilt ate at her visibly. She'd apologize constantly for putting us in this position, for not leaving Mike sooner, for being a burden on her sister. School became complicated in new ways. The address change meant I technically should have switched districts, but my aunt pulled strings to keep me at my current school through the end of the year. I couldn't face starting over somewhere new while everything else in my life was in chaos. Mike's attempts to contact us escalated. He showed up at my aunt's house one evening, pounding on the door and demanding to see his family. My aunt called the police while my mother and I huddled upstairs. The officers made him leave, but not before he screamed threats about custody and financial ruin loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. The restraining order paperwork felt both protective and terrifying. Seeing Mike's behavior documented in legal language made it real in a way that living through it hadn't. The lawyer explained it was temporary, that we'd need to go through proper proceedings for something permanent. My eating remained a struggle. Without Mike's oppressive monitoring, I thought meals would become easier. Instead, I found myself unable to eat much of anything. My body had learned to associate food with danger. Even safe foods at my aunt's table triggered anxiety responses I couldn't control. My aunt noticed but didn't comment directly. She started leaving small snacks around the house in places I frequented. A bowl of crackers on the coffee table, sliced apples on the kitchen counter, granola bars in the living room. I could graze without the pressure of formal meals. 3 weeks after we'd left, Mike was fired from his new job. We found out through the divorce lawyer, who'd been tracking his employment for support calculations. Apparently, he'd gotten into a confrontation with a supervisor about portion sizes at a company lunch. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. This made him more dangerous. Without work to focus on, he devoted himself to making our lives difficult. He contested every aspect of the divorce, demanding detailed financial records, questioning my mother's fitness as a parent, claiming I'd been coached to lie about the food situation. The court-ordered mediation session was a nightmare. Mike showed up in his best suit, playing the wronged husband perfectly. He brought documentation of every penny he'd spent on us, presenting himself as a generous provider whose ungrateful family had abandoned him over reasonable household rules. My mother sat across from him, shrinking into herself as he spoke. The mediator, a tired-looking woman who'd clearly seen too many acrimonious divorces, tried to find middle ground. Mike insisted on joint custody, arguing that children needed structure and discipline. When the mediator asked about the food monitoring and debt system, Mike had an answer ready. He called it a financial literacy program, designed to teach me responsibility. He'd even created fake worksheets and educational materials to support his claim, backdating them to make it look like a thoughtful parenting strategy. I wasn't allowed in the mediation, but I could see my mother afterward. She looked defeated, like all the progress we'd made was crumbling. Mike had been so convincing, so prepared. The mediator had suggested a graduated visitation schedule, starting with supervised visits and potentially moving to unsupervised if things went well. That night, I couldn't sleep. The thought of spending weekends with Mike, even supervised, made me physically sick. I snuck downstairs and found my aunt at her computer, designing a logo for a client. She took one look at my face and pushed her work aside. I explained my fears about the visitation schedule. My aunt listened, then asked if I'd kept any evidence of what really happened. I remembered my hidden notebook, still packed in a box in my room. Together, we went through it page by page. The entries were detailed. Dates, times, foods, amounts charged, hours spent at the table. I'd drawn pictures of particularly awful meals, documented every instance of vomiting, noted when my mother tried to help and Mike stopped her. It was all there in my shaky handwriting. My aunt photographed every page. She called the lawyer first thing in the morning, explaining what we had. The lawyer was interested but cautious. Children's testimony was tricky, especially with Mike already painting me as manipulated and ungrateful. We needed more. The lawyer suggested gathering medical records, school documentation, anything that showed the physical impact of Mike's financial literacy program. My aunt drove me to the pediatrician that afternoon for a full checkup. The doctor's findings were stark. I'd lost 15 pounds in 3 months, dropping me well below healthy weight for my age and height. My blood work showed nutritional deficiencies. She noted signs of chronic stress and asked gentle questions about home life. When I explained about the forced eating and debt system, she stopped typing and looked at me directly. She asked if I felt safe now. I nodded, explaining about living with my aunt. She documented everything carefully, using clinical language that would hold up in court. The school counselor provided additional documentation. She'd kept notes from when the nurse had called about my lunch skipping, including Mike's dismissive response. Teachers provided statements about my declining performance and obvious weight loss. Mrs. Chen wrote a detailed letter about finding me hiding in the library during lunch periods. Armed with this evidence, our lawyer requested an emergency hearing to reconsider the visitation arrangement. Mike fought it, but the judge agreed to review the new documentation. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. During those 2 weeks, Mike's behavior escalated further. He started showing up at places he thought we might be. The grocery store, the park, the library, always staying just far enough away to not violate the restraining order, but making sure we saw him. My mother got a job at a local bakery, decorating cakes and handling customer orders. It didn't pay much, but she glowed with pride at earning her own money. Mike found out where she worked and started calling during her shifts, demanding to speak with her, threatening to show up during business hours. Her boss, a kind woman named Catherine who'd gone through her own difficult divorce, installed a new phone system that could block specific numbers. She also kept Mike's photo by the register and instructed all employees to call the police if he appeared. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. My aunt made chamomile tea and sat with me, not talking, just being present. My mother paced the house, organizing and reorganizing our documentation. We all knew this hearing would determine the trajectory of our lives. The courthouse felt impossibly large and intimidating. Mike arrived looking polished and confident, accompanied by a lawyer who specialized in father's rights cases. He'd clearly spent money he didn't have on legal representation. Our lawyer presented the evidence methodically. My notebook, the medical records, the school documentation, photos of the debt tally on the refrigerator. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes, reviewed each piece carefully. When Mike's lawyer cross-examined, he tried to paint the food monitoring as concern for my health. He suggested my autism made me a picky eater, and Mike was simply trying to ensure proper nutrition. The debt system was repositioned as an advanced allowance program, teaching financial responsibility. Then our lawyer introduced something we hadn't expected. Mrs. Henderson had provided a detailed affidavit about the dinner party and the company picnic. She described my obvious distress at their home, Mike's rigid control, and most importantly, his reaction when confronted with evidence of abuse. She'd included her own observation that Mike seemed more concerned with his professional image than my well-being. Her husband had provided a supporting statement about Mike's termination, noting that his behavior at the picnic had demonstrated values incompatible with their company culture. Mike's composed facade cracked. He interrupted proceedings to insist the Hendersons had misunderstood, that they'd been poisoned against him by my manipulation. The judge had to call for order twice. When it came time for the judge's decision, the courtroom felt airless. She stated that while she understood the desire to maintain parent-child relationships, the evidence suggested Mike's parenting methods had caused documented physical and psychological harm. She denied unsupervised visitation entirely. Supervised visits would only be permitted after Mike completed parenting classes, specifically addressing children with special needs, and only if I agreed to participate. The existing restraining order would remain in place. Mike erupted. He shouted about his rights, about conspiracy, about how we'd ruined his life over normal parenting. Security had to escort him out as he continued yelling threats about appeals and custody battles. In the parking lot afterward, my mother cried for the first time in months. Not the quiet, defeated tears I'd grown used to, but deep, cathartic sobs. My aunt held her while I stood nearby, feeling strangely empty. We'd won, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. The drive home was quiet. We stopped for ice cream, a small celebration my aunt insisted on. I managed half a small cup of vanilla before my stomach rebelled. Progress was slow, but it was still progress. That evening we ordered pizza and ate in the living room, something Mike never would have allowed. My mother managed 2 slices, more than I'd seen her eat in months. My aunt put on a movie, something light and silly that required no emotional investment. Halfway through, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Mike had gotten a new phone. The message was long, alternating between apologies and accusations, promises to change, and threats about what would happen if we didn't come back. My aunt took my phone and blocked the number without reading the rest. She reminded me that healing wasn't linear, that there would be setbacks and hard days, but we were safe now. That was what mattered. The next months blurred together. Mike continued his harassment campaign through various channels, each one blocked as it appeared. He lost his apartment and moved in with a cousin who eventually kicked him out for similar controlling behavior. Last we heard, he was living in his car and working temporary construction jobs. My mother flourished at the bakery. Her decorating skills improved rapidly, and Catherine began letting her design custom cakes. She started dating a regular customer, a soft-spoken man named Robert who owned a bookstore. He never pushed, never demanded, just offered quiet companionship and respect. I started high school at a new district, where nobody knew about the food debt or the metal chair. I joined the art club and discovered I had a talent for painting. My therapist helped me work through the food trauma with exposure therapy and coping strategies. Meals slowly became less fraught. I learned to identify safe foods and honor my body's signals. Some days were harder than others. Some textures still made me gag, but I was learning to trust that food could be neutral, even enjoyable, rather than a weapon. My aunt converted her garage into an art studio where I could paint after school. She never commented on the recurring themes in my work. Plates of food transformed into flowers, chairs dissolving into butterflies, scales becoming birds taking flight. One afternoon, while organizing boxes in the basement, I found the folded debt tally I'd saved as evidence. $852 in Mike's neat handwriting. I stared at it for a long moment, remembering the weight of that impossible number, the hours of suffering it represented. I took it to my studio and incorporated it into a painting. The numbers became part of a larger piece about transformation, the digits morphing into stars in a night sky. When it dried, I donated it to a silent auction benefiting the local autism support center. It sold for $500. The buyer was Mrs. Henderson, who'd stayed in touch throughout our journey. She hung it in her office as a reminder, she said, that truth has power when brought into the light. The autism support group became a regular part of my life. I met other kids with similar sensory issues, learned strategies for managing difficult textures, discovered I wasn't alone in my struggles. We shared stories and safe foods, building community around understanding rather than judgment. My mother married Robert in a small ceremony in his bookstore. I painted decorations for the reception, swirls of color that had nothing to do with food or control or debt. Mike wasn't invited, obviously, but we heard he'd moved several states away. Still bitter, but no longer our problem. At the reception, I ate wedding cake without fear. Just a small piece, vanilla with raspberry filling, but I enjoyed each bite. My aunt smiled at me across the room, raising her champagne glass in a quiet toast to how far we'd come. The metal folding chair, the stopwatch, and the kitchen scale had long since been donated. In their place, we'd built a life of choices and respect, understanding and accommodation. It wasn't perfect. Recovery never never is, but it was ours, free from the weight of impossible debts and cruel arithmetic. I kept painting, processing trauma through art. My pieces began selling at local galleries, providing a small income that was mine alone. No one monitored how I spent it. No one charged me for not finishing a project. The freedom felt revolutionary. Years later, when I started college, I chose to study art therapy. I wanted to help other kids find their voices when words weren't enough. My professor asked us to create a piece representing our journey to this field. I painted a girl at a dinner table, but instead of food on her plate, there were keys. Keys to doors she hadn't known existed. Keys to futures that weren't measured in dollars and cents. Keys to a life where nourishment came in many forms, and none of them required payment. The painting won a scholarship that covered my textbooks for the year. I used the money to take my mother and aunt out for a celebration dinner. We ordered what we wanted, ate what we could, and left the rest without guilt or consequence. That's the thing about survival. It teaches you that victory isn't always grand or dramatic. Sometimes it's just the quiet ability to leave food on your plate, to choose your own chair, to exist without a running tally of your worth. Mike became a cautionary tale we rarely discussed, a shadow that grew smaller with each passing year. The last update came through the legal system. He'd been arrested for harassment in another state, apparently trying similar control tactics with a new girlfriend who'd had the wisdom to call the police. But that was his story, not ours. Ours was written in birthday cakes eaten without timers, in family dinners where everyone chose their own portions, in the simple revolutionary act of saying, I'm full, and having that be enough. The debt he'd assigned me, $852 for the crime of having autism and human limits, was never paid. Instead, I learned something worth more than any amount, that some debts are too cruel to honor, and the real courage lies in refusing to accept bills for being human. This story took us from kitchen tyranny to art therapy, proving that sometimes the best revenge is just living well and painting your way through it. Subscribe for more content just like this.